1978, IWC and Porsche Design entered into a 20-year agreement to make watches together. IWC would produce the watches, Porsche Design would do what it did best, come up with innovative, modern, and stylish designs. More than 20 years after the partnership ended, those used watches are still bought and sold every day, and without much hype. But I think that should change. I think it's time for collectors to take a closer look at the prolific and original run of Porsche Design IWC watches. And let's start with this 3743 Chronograph. This watch is on loan from Time Titans. It's for sale, at least it is at the moment I'm making this video. I wanted to borrow it because the 3743 IWC Porsche Design gives me another chance to shed light on an interesting and somewhat forgotten corner of the watch world. In 1978, when IWC and Porsche Design began their partnership, the quartz crisis was devastating Swiss watchmakers. Quartz watches were more reliable, more robust, and far cheaper than mechanical watches. Like most Swiss brands, IWC was struggling. They needed to try something different, and one way was to partner with a studio that could provide new designs to capture new audiences. In 1963, Ferdinand Porsche helped design and produce an automotive legend, the 911. In 1972, he left the family business to start his own design studio, specializing in modern German aesthetics. And that's exactly what the watch market got with the first IWC Porsche Design watch, the 3510 Compass watch, or in German, Kompassuhr. 2 years later, in 1980, IWC and Porsche Design broke new ground by producing the world's first fully titanium watch, the 40mm reference 3700 Chronograph. This was the first time a watch featured a titanium bracelet and the first time a chronograph had a titanium case. For that reason, this reference is often referred to as the Titan, which is the German word for titanium. Some iterations even had Titan engraved on the case. The 3700, 3702, and 3704 used a decorated Valjoux 7750 movement, whose chronograph functions were actuated by these kind of hidden paddle pushers at 230 and 430. The result was a design much cleaner and more clever than nearly any chronograph available at the time. Which leads us to this 3743 chronograph. While it looks similar to the 3700, there are some major and interesting differences. The 3743 was produced from 1988 to 1998. By this time, IWC had pushed back against the quartz movement that had decimated the industry. Pushed back and then embraced it, because inside this watch is a quartz movement. And not just any quartz movement, but one made by the watchmaker's watchmaker, Jaeger-LeCoultre, who made movements for the first Royal Oak, the Nautilus, and even the first Cartier Santos. And not only that, but the movement in here is the world's first mecha-quartz movement. Hold up, what? I'll explain. In 1987, Jaeger-LeCoultre started producing the caliber 630. It was clear that quartz wasn't going anywhere and that it had some serious advantages over mechanical watches. Seiko had already started producing a fully quartz chronograph, but Switzerland thought they could do better. A mecha-quartz movement tries to marry the accuracy and reliability of quartz watches with the feel and appearance of mechanical watches. Time regulation uses the vibration of a quartz crystal, and a battery supplies the power, but the chronograph functions are started, stopped, and reset with good old gears and springs. Going the extra mile, the movement is even a little decorated, utilizing some Geneva stripes. It also has a regulating screw in the bottom left. I've read that these movements can be accurate to 1 second per month if serviced properly. The 630 movement ended up in dozens of IWC and JLC watches, which speaks to its success mechanically and financially. Today, mecha-quartz calibers are pretty common, especially the VK movements made by Seiko. You'll find them in watches not just from Seiko, but in a lot of great smaller brands like Dan Henry, Yema, Brew, Autodromo, and Nezumi. Unlike its fully mechanical brethren, the IWC 3743 places all of the registers in the lower half of the dial with the date window at 4:30. The general layout of the 3743 was always the same because the movement was always the same. but there were some variations in the dial text. One I found features IWC at 12 o'clock rather than squeezed down at 7:30 like on this watch. It's interesting to consider how these two brands negotiated for top billing on the dial. Those were probably some contentious meetings. All variants though use tritium lume on the markers and hands, which means that by now the markers and hands have gone dark, but have patinaed into a rich, buttery color. The case and bracelet hold to that clean, modern aesthetic. The titanium is bead blasted and sleek, with a Porsche Design logo on the single button deployant clasp. Each link in this bracelet is exactly 5 mm long. I've read that IWC told the German military the bracelet could be used as an emergency ruler to measure maps. It's possible, but I'm skeptical. The chronograph tachometer is printed on the underside of the sapphire crystal. This reduces parallax and really improves legibility, which is good because this watch is small. The IWC 3743 is about 8.5 mm thick and 36 mm in diameter. In the late 80s, 36 mm was a totally acceptable size for a men's sport watch. I mean, it still is, but a lot of people just don't know it. When you subtract the distance from the case sides to the bezel, then from the bezel to the tachometer, then from the tachometer to the actual dial, it could be tricky to read this watch. I don't think I'd be able to read the subdials at a quick glance, but I have no problem reading the time. All Porsche Design IWC watches use high contrast dials and hands that really help. And you can't miss the red-orange chronograph seconds hand. It's easy to see and that color adds so much to this design. On the wrist, the size takes a little getting used to, at least for someone like me who's used to wearing watches from 40 to even 50 mm. But if you've ever worn a watch this size for more than a couple days, you probably know how quickly you can adapt. And that adaptation is really helped along with the slimness of the case and the light weight of titanium. With all of the links in this watch, it weighs just 70 grams. It's basically unnoticeable until you look at your wrist, and then when you look, you smile. At least I do. I find this watch and many IWC Porsche watches fascinating. To understand this watch is to understand a chapter in the history of horology, when technology forced the big players to experiment, innovate, and find new partners. When the threat was so great that IWC was willing to give up top billing to a design studio and relegate their own logo into a corner. And it worked. IWC survived and thrived. There are so many watches from the 80s and 90s that are lost to time, and a few that I kinda wish were lost to time. But these Porsche Design IWC pieces stand out even today, and I think they always will.